Hell's Angel walked into a store and found a cashier crying. What he did next stunned everyone. The thundering rumble of a motorcycle engine echoed through the sleepy streets of Miller's Creek. Heads turned and curtains twitched as Ray Bear Lawson guided his massive Harley down Main Street, the chrome gleaming under the afternoon sun. The peaceful town, with its neat rows of modest homes and carefully tended flower boxes, seemed a world away from the chaos he usually called home. Bear's massive frame cast a long shadow as he pulled into the convenience store parking lot. His leather vest, adorned with the distinctive Hell's Angels patches, creaked as he swung his leg over the bike. The summer heat had him sweating beneath his thick beard, and his tattooed arms glistened in the sunlight. An old couple hurried to their car as Bear approached the store entrance. He was used to this reaction, people scurrying away, avoiding eye contact. His reputation preceded him, and his appearance alone was enough to make most folks nervous. Standing 6'4" with shoulders like a linebacker, covered in tattoos and leather, he knew exactly what he looked like to these small-town folks. The store's bell chimed as he pushed open the door, the cool air conditioning a welcome relief from the heat outside. His heavy boots thudded against the linoleum floor as he stepped inside. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the neat rows of snacks and supplies. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. A young mother grabbed her child's hand and quickly made her way to the exit, mumbling a quiet, "Excuse me," as she squeezed past him. Bear kept his face neutral, though the familiar sting of being feared hadn't dulled over the years. He scanned the empty store, his eyes falling on the lone cashier behind the counter. She was young, probably mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. What caught his attention wasn't her appearance, but the way she was hastily wiping at her eyes with the sleeve of her blue uniform shirt. Sophie, according to her name tag, quickly straightened up when she noticed him watching. She tried to compose herself, but her eyes were red and puffy, and despite her efforts to hide it, fresh tears threatened to spill over. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter, forcing a professional smile that didn't reach her eyes. Something about her distress stirred an unexpected feeling in Bear's chest. He'd seen plenty of tears in his life, usually caused by men like him, but this was different. This wasn't fear or anger. This was raw pain, the kind that comes from life's cruel twists and turns. He stood there for a moment, his usual gruff demeanor wavering as he watched her try to maintain her composure. Despite his intimidating presence, she was clearly fighting her own battles, ones that had nothing to do with the fearsome biker who had just walked into her store. The vulnerability in her expression made him feel strangely protective, an unfamiliar sensation for someone who typically inspired fear rather than concern. The silence in the store grew heavy, broken only by the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the distant sound of traffic outside. Bear shifted his weight, the floorboards creaking beneath him, as Sophie wiped away one final tear with shaking fingers. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Bear made his way to the counter, his heavy boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Though his massive frame cast a shadow over Sophie, his approach was surprisingly gentle, almost cautious. The leather of his jacket creaked as he stopped, keeping a respectful distance. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she tried to compose herself, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blue store apron. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her tears, least of all someone like him. The man before her was the definition of intimidating. Arms covered in tattoos, a thick beard, and the unmistakable vest of the Hell's Angels. "You okay?" Bear's voice was unexpectedly soft, barely above a whisper. The gruff tenderness in his tone caught Sophie off guard. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision. "I'm fine," she managed, but her voice cracked on the second word. She reached for a tissue from beneath the counter, dabbing at her eyes. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be—" "Don't apologize," Bear said, his deep voice still gentle. He shifted his weight, leather creaking again. "Something's wrong. Anyone can see that." Sophie looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time. Behind the tough exterior, his eyes held something she hadn't expected. Concern. Real, genuine concern. It was that unexpected kindness that made her defenses start to crumble. She started, then had to take a deep breath. It's my mom. The words came out choked, and she pressed the tissue to her mouth. Bear remained silent, patient. His stillness somehow made it easier for her to continue. She's sick. Really sick. Sophie's voice quivered. The doctors say... She swallowed hard, fighting back a fresh wave of tears. They say it's cancer, stage 4, and I'm trying to help with the bills, but everything's so expensive. The treatments, the medications. Her words began to tumble out faster. I'm working double shifts here, but it's not enough. Nothing's enough. The tears she'd been fighting all morning finally spilled over. I don't know what to do anymore, she confessed, her shoulders shaking. I'm sorry. I shouldn't be telling you all this. You just wanted to buy something, and here I am. Bear didn't move, didn't try to reach out or offer empty platitudes. He just stood there, his presence somehow steadying despite his intimidating appearance. His face remained hard to read, but his eyes never left her, showing that he was listening. Really listening. Sophie wiped her eyes again, but the tears wouldn't stop. She's all I have, she whispered. And I'm watching her slip away, and I can't do anything to stop it. Her voice broke completely on the last word, and she covered her face with her hands, unable to hold back the sobs that had been building all morning. Through her tears, she was dimly aware that Bear hadn't walked away, hadn't dismissed her emotional display. He remained at the counter, a silent witness to her pain, his massive frame somehow providing an unexpected sense of shelter as she finally let herself break down. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Bear made his way to the counter, his heavy boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Though his massive frame cast a shadow over Sophie, his approach was surprisingly gentle, almost cautious. The leather of his jacket creaked as he stopped, keeping a respectful distance. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she tried to compose herself, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her blue store apron. She hadn't expected anyone to notice her tears, least of all someone like him. You okay? Bear's voice was unexpectedly soft, barely above a whisper, contrasting sharply with his intimidating appearance. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism. I'm sorry, her voice cracked. It's just been really hard lately. Bear remained silent, his weathered face unreadable beneath his graying beard. His dark eyes, usually sharp and alert, softened as he watched her struggle to keep her composure. My mom, Sophie continued, the words spilling out before she could stop them. She's really sick. The doctors say... She took a shaky breath. The bills keep piling up, and I don't know how much longer I can keep everything together. Bear stood perfectly still, his massive hands resting on the counter. The collection of tattoos on his knuckles, faded reminders of a violent past, seemed at odds with the gentleness in his eyes. Without a word, he reached into the pocket of his leather vest. The movement was slow, deliberate. Sophie watched as he pulled out a worn leather wallet, its edges frayed from years of use. His calloused fingers opened it, revealing a thick stack of bills. The only sound in the store was the quiet hum of the refrigerators and the rustle of paper as Bear counted out several $100 bills. He laid them on the counter with the same care someone might handle a fragile object. Sophie's eyes widened as she stared at the money. Her lips parted in surprise, but no words came out. The stack of bills sat between them like a bridge between two very different worlds. Bear's hand rested briefly on top of the money, his silver rings catching the harsh store lighting. Then he gently pushed it toward her. Their eyes met for a moment, his steady and certain, hers filled with disbelief and gathering tears. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Sophie's hand moved toward the money, then pulled back, unsure. I can't, she started to say. But Bear was already turning away, his broad shoulders straight, his steps measured as he headed toward the door. The bell above the entrance chimed as he pushed it open, the sound jarring in the quiet store. Sophie stood frozen behind the counter, staring at the money. Her fingers touched the edges of the bills, as if checking to make sure they were real. Questions raced through her mind. Why would he help her? What made this intimidating stranger show such unexpected kindness? The rumble of a motorcycle engine cut through her thoughts. Through the store window, she watched as Bear's massive bike roared to life, its chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. In moments, he was gone, leaving Sophie alone with her racing thoughts and a counter full of cash that could change everything. Sophie pushed open the heavy glass door of the convenience store, stepping into the cool evening air. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink. Her legs felt wobbly, and her mind struggled to process what had just happened inside. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just her old blue Honda Civic and a few other cars scattered about. The rumble of a motorcycle in the distance made her turn her head, but Bear was long gone. All that remained was the weight of the money in her pocket and the lingering scent of leather and motor oil in the store. She fumbled with her keys, dropping them twice before managing to unlock her car door. Inside, she sat behind the wheel, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles turned white. The leather was warm from the afternoon sun, but Sophie barely noticed. "This can't be real," she whispered to herself, reaching into her pocket. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the stack of bills Bear had left. 100, 200, 500. She counted it again, still in disbelief. It was enough to cover her mother's medical bills for the month. Sophie leaned back against the headrest, closing her eyes. The image of Bear's face flooded her mind. Not the scary biker everyone whispered about, but the man who'd looked at her with such unexpected kindness in his eyes. His weathered face had remained stoic, but there had been something there, something gentle beneath the tough exterior. The parking lot lights flickered on as dusk settled in, casting long shadows across the asphalt. Sophie watched a paper bag tumble across the empty space, carried by the evening breeze. Everything felt surreal, like she was moving through a dream. Her phone buzzed in her purse, startling her from her thoughts. She dug through her bag, past her wallet and loose receipts, finally finding it at the bottom. The screen lit up with a new message notification. The familiar number of her mother's doctor made her heart skip a beat. Sophie's hands began to shake again, but for an entirely different reason now. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself before opening the text. The words on the screen blurred as tears welled up in her eyes. Her mother's condition had deteriorated significantly. The doctor recommended immediate transfer to a specialized facility in Arizona, hundreds of miles away from this small town Sophie called home. Sophie's chest tightened as the implications sank in. She'd need to make a decision, and soon. The specialized care could help her mother, but it would mean leaving everything behind: her job, her tiny apartment, the life she'd built here. And now, strangely enough, she found herself thinking about Bear and his unexpected kindness. The phone felt heavy in her hands as she stared at the message. The money in her pocket, meant to help keep her afloat, now seemed like both a blessing and a cruel twist of fate. Just when someone had shown her such extraordinary kindness, life was demanding she choose between staying and leaving. The parking lot had grown dark now, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across her dashboard. Sophie sat there, clutching her phone, torn between two paths: staying in a town where she'd just witnessed an act of kindness that defied all expectations, or leaving to be with her mother when she needed her most. Sophie sat at her kitchen table, staring at the half-filled cardboard box in front of her. The evening light filtered through her small apartment's window, casting long shadows across the scattered items she'd started packing. Her mother's framed photo smiled at her from beside a stack of medical bills, the image taken during happier times before the illness had taken its toll. The buzz of her phone made her jump. Another text from her Aunt Janet. "Your mom's asking for you." Sophie's chest tightened as she read the words. She set the phone face down on the table, unable to look at it anymore. Her gaze drifted to the money Bear had given her, now neatly counted and tucked into an envelope. The unexpected kindness from such an intimidating stranger had shaken her worldview. It felt wrong to leave now, when someone had shown such compassion without asking for anything in return. Sophie picked up a coffee mug, turning it over in her hands before wrapping it in newspaper. The familiar routine of packing brought no comfort tonight. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Sometimes the hardest choices are between two good things, honey." The ticking of the kitchen clock seemed louder than usual as Sophie stood up and walked to her small living room window. The town's lights twinkled in the growing darkness, each one representing a life, a story, a connection. This place had been her home for the past 3 years. She'd built a life here, modest as it was. Running her fingers through her hair, Sophie returned to the kitchen and picked up her phone again. She scrolled through her recent calls. Her mother's doctors, the hospital's financial department, her aunt, Janet. There had to be a way to make this work without completely uprooting her life. The coffee maker gurgled to life as Sophie pressed the button, needing the familiar comfort of her evening routine. The aroma filled her small kitchen as she pulled up her laptop, opening multiple tabs: remote caregiving resources, online support groups, video calling services. Her mother's voice came back to her again, this time from a conversation just last week. "Don't put your life on hold for me, Sophie. I need you to live yours too." Sophie's hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug as she began to formulate a plan. She could increase her video calls with her mom, coordinate more closely with Janet, who lived closer to her mother, and research additional resources. The hospital had a social worker. Maybe they could help arrange for more in-home care. Looking at the half-packed box, Sophie stood up and began removing items, placing them back in their familiar spots. The photo of her mother went back on the shelf where it belonged. She wouldn't run away from this challenge. She'd face it head-on, finding a way to be there for her mother while maintaining the life she'd built here. Tomorrow would bring another shift at the convenience store. Sophie set her alarm, feeling both anxious and somehow lighter after making her decision. She would stay, at least for now, and try to find a balance between her responsibilities here and her duties as a daughter. It wouldn't be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. As she prepared for bed, Sophie thought about Bear's unexpected kindness. Perhaps it had been more than just financial help. It had been a reminder that sometimes hope comes from the most unexpected places, and that running away isn't always the answer to life's challenges. The morning sun streamed through the convenience store's windows, casting long rectangles of light across the linoleum floor. Sophie straightened the display of candy bars near the register, trying to keep her hands busy. The bell above the door chimed as Mrs. Peterson and Linda, two of the town's most devoted coffee drinkers, made their daily morning appearance. "I'm telling you, Linda, my nephew Tommy saw the whole thing," Mrs. Peterson said, her voice carrying across the quiet store. "That scary-looking biker, the one they call Bear. He just pulled out this thick wad of cash and left it right there on the counter." Sophie's fingers fumbled with a Snickers bar, nearly dropping it. She kept her head down, pretending to be absorbed in her task while her cheeks grew warm. "No way," Linda replied, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Those Hell's Angels are nothing but trouble. Remember what happened over in Carson City last year? Well, that's what I thought too," Mrs. Peterson continued, adding cream to her coffee. "But Tommy said the man was actually quite gentle about it. Didn't say much, just helped someone in need and walked away. Can you believe it?" The women made their way to the counter, where Sophie couldn't avoid them any longer. She managed a polite smile as she rang up their coffees. "Morning, Sophie dear," Mrs. Peterson said, studying her face carefully. "You were working that day, weren't you, when that biker came in?" Sophie nodded slightly, keeping her movements measured and controlled. "Yes, ma'am." "See, I told you," Mrs. Peterson nudged Linda with her elbow. "My Tommy wouldn't make something like that up." The bell chimed again, and Mr. Rodriguez from the auto shop walked in. "You ladies talking about that Bear fellow?" he asked, joining the conversation uninvited. "Heard he helped someone out with medical bills. Never would have expected that from one of them." Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she handed Mrs. Peterson her change. The private moment she'd shared with Bear, that unexpected act of kindness, was becoming town gossip. Some people spoke about it with wonder, others with suspicion, but everyone seemed to have an opinion. Throughout the morning, more customers filtered in, each carrying their own version of the story. Some claimed Bear had given thousands of dollars. Others insisted it must have been drug money. A few even suggested he was trying to buy protection for his gang. "Maybe he's not as bad as everyone thinks," Sophie heard someone say. "Or maybe he's trying to fool us all," another responded. Sophie kept her head down, focusing on restocking shelves and counting inventory. She thought about Bear's quiet demeanor, the gentle way he'd placed the money on the counter, how he hadn't wanted recognition or praise. The real story was simpler and more beautiful than any of their speculation, but she kept that knowledge to herself. The morning dragged on, and Sophie felt the weight of curious glances and unasked questions. She busied herself with work, letting the gossip swirl around her like leaves in the wind. Part of her wanted to defend Bear, to tell them about the compassion she'd seen in his eyes, but another part wanted to protect that moment, to keep it safe from the town's endless speculation. She organized the same shelf for the third time that morning, listening to the mixture of skepticism and admiration in customers' voices as they discussed a mysterious biker who'd shown unexpected kindness. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight filtering through the store's windows and making the dust motes dance. Sophie stood behind the counter, methodically counting the bills in the register. The familiar rumble of a motorcycle engine made her pause, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the deep sound. Through the glass front of the store, she watched Bear's massive frame dismount from his bike. His leather vest caught the morning light, the patches and emblems telling their own silent story. Sophie's hands grew clammy as she remembered their last encounter, the weight of his unexpected kindness still fresh in her mind. The bell chimed as Bear stepped inside. His boots made heavy sounds against the floor as he moved through the aisles with surprising grace for such a large man. Sophie tried to look busy, straightening items that didn't need straightening. When Bear finally approached the counter, he gave her a simple nod. His face remained neutral, but his eyes held a gentleness that seemed at odds with his intimidating appearance. He placed a few items on the counter, a pack of gum, some beef jerky, and a bottle of water. "Morning," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Good morning," Sophie replied, her voice steadier than she expected. She began scanning his items, aware of his presence, but no longer afraid. "Weather's turning nice," Bear commented, glancing out the window. The casual observation caught Sophie off guard. She looked up, meeting his eyes. "Yeah, spring's finally here. The flowers are starting to bloom in the park." Bear nodded, pulling out his wallet. His movements were deliberate, careful. Neither of them mentioned the money from before, but it hung in the air between them like an unspoken understanding. "You been here long?" he asked, handing over a 20. Sophie counted his change. "About 8 months. Needed a change of pace." She paused, then added, "The people here are interesting." A slight smile tugged at the corner of Bear's mouth. "That's one way to put it." Their eyes met again, and this time Sophie saw something more in his expression, a hint of humor, maybe even warmth. She found herself smiling back. "Your mother," he said after a moment, his voice softer. "She getting good care?" The question was simple, but the concern behind it felt genuine. Sophie nodded, touched by his remembered. "Yes, she is. Thank you for asking." Bear gathered his purchases, tucking them into the pockets of his vest. He turned to leave, but paused at the counter. His large frame blocked out some of the morning light, creating a shadow that fell across the counter. When he looked back at her, his expression was unreadable, yet somehow reassuring. Those eyes, which had probably seen more darkness than Sophie could imagine, held something protective in them now. It wasn't a look that needed words. It said enough on its own. Without another word, Bear headed for the door, the bell chiming his exit. Sophie watched through the window as he mounted his bike. The morning sun caught his leather vest again as he kicked the motorcycle to life. As he pulled away, she felt a strange sense of security settle over her. That look he'd given her stayed with her, like a silent guardian's promise. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the convenience store windows, making the aisles look like zebra stripes on the linoleum floor. Sophie was restocking the candy display when she heard the distinctive rumble of a motorcycle. Her hand paused midway through arranging a row of chocolate bars. This engine sound was different from Bear's, lighter, higher-pitched. Through the storefront windows, she spotted a black Harley-Davidson pulling into the parking lot. The rider wore the same leather vest as Bear, complete with the hellsangels patches that usually made townspeople cross to the other side of the street. Sophie's throat felt dry as she watched the man park his bike. He was shorter than Bear, but just as intimidating, with sleeve tattoos covering both arms and a thick beard that reached his chest. A silver chain hung from his belt to his wallet, catching the sunlight as he walked toward the entrance. The bell above the door chimed. Sophie straightened up, brushing off her hands on her apron. She forced herself to stay behind the counter instead of retreating to the stockroom like her instincts suggested. The biker's boots thudded heavily against the floor as he made his way through the store. Several customers who had been browsing quickly paid for their items and left, casting nervous glances over their shoulders. Soon, Sophie found herself alone in the store with the gang member. He took his time, walking up and down the aisles as if looking for something specific, but his eyes kept darting in her direction. Sophie's fingers found the edge of the counter, gripping it tightly. She thought about Bear's kindness, trying to remind herself that these men might not be exactly what they seemed. Still, her heart hammered in her chest as the biker finally approached the counter. Up close, she could see the crow's feet around his eyes and the gray streaks in his beard. His expression wasn't menacing at all. If anything, he looked slightly uncomfortable, like someone forced to make small talk at a party. "You're Sophie?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. She nodded, not trusting her voice just yet. The biker shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Name's Tommy. I'm a friend of Bear's." He cleared his throat. "He asked me to check in on you, make sure you're doing all right." Sophie blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected concern in his tone. "Oh," she managed to say. "Bear's not usually the type to, well, he doesn't usually get involved in other people's business," Tommy continued, scratching his beard. "But he seemed worried about you, wanted to make sure what he gave you was enough to help." The genuine concern in his voice made Sophie's tension ease slightly. She found herself remembering Bear's quiet generosity, the way he'd helped her without making a big deal about it. That's very kind of him," Sophie said, her voice steadier now. "Please tell him it helped more than he knows." Tommy nodded, studying her face as if checking for signs of distress. "You doing okay otherwise? Bear mentioned something about your mom being sick." Sophie's surprise must have shown on her face because Tommy quickly added, "We might look rough, but we look after our own, and Bear seems to think you need looking after." Sophie sat at her small kitchen table, her laptop casting a blue glow across her face in the dim evening light. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she dug deeper into articles about Maxwell Holdings, the company trying to buy out the hellsangels property. "There has to be more here," she muttered, scrolling through business records. The businessman, Richard Maxwell, had his name all over the local news, always shown in expensive suits, shaking hands with important people. But something about his perfect smile made Sophie's skin crawl. She opened another tab and typed in Maxwell Holdings complaints. The results made her sit up straighter. Several small businesses had mysteriously closed after refusing to sell to Maxwell. Health code violations appeared out of nowhere. Building inspectors found sudden structural problems. The pattern was clear, but the authorities never seemed to connect the dots. Sophie grabbed her notebook and started writing. 3 businesses last year alone had shut down after standing firm against Maxwell's offers. Their owners had moved away, leaving behind empty buildings that Maxwell's company quickly snatched up at bargain prices. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother's nurse reporting stable vital signs. Sophie smiled briefly before returning to her research. The screen showed a map of Maxwell's properties spreading across town like an ink stain. The hellsangels' land sat right in the middle of it all, a blank space in Maxwell's empire. She clicked through public records, tax documents, and business licenses. Most people would have gotten lost in the sea of paperwork, but Sophie had always been good at finding patterns. Years of managing her mother's medical records had taught her how to navigate bureaucratic mazes. A name caught her eye, repeated across different companies, all tied to Maxwell. She opened a new tab and searched for it. Her eyes widened as news articles popped up from other states. The same pattern: businesses forced out, mysterious accidents, and always Maxwell's company swooping in to save the day. But there was more. Some articles mentioned investigations into money laundering, though they'd all been suddenly dropped. Others talked about workplace accidents that had been quickly settled out of court. Maxwell's name stayed clean, but his associates kept appearing in police reports. Sophie's hands trembled as she realized what she was seeing. This wasn't just about Bear's land. Maxwell was part of something bigger, something dangerous. The Hells Angels weren't just fighting for their property. They were standing in the way of a criminal operation that had been growing for years. She glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. Her shift started in 5 hours, but sleep was the last thing on her mind. The quiet of her apartment felt heavy with the weight of what she'd discovered. This wasn't just about helping Bear anymore. If Maxwell succeeded in taking over the Angels' land, he'd have control over the heart of their small town. Sophie opened a new tab, Document, and started organizing her findings. Her hands moved with purpose now, driven by more than curiosity. The whole town was at risk, and she might be the only one who could see the full picture. She had to dig deeper, had to find proof that others couldn't ignore. Bear and his gang weren't the criminals here. They were standing against something much worse. Sophie felt a new resolve settling over her as she worked. She would find the truth, no matter what it took. Their town's future depended on it. The bell above the convenience store door chimed as Bear walked in, his massive frame filling the entrance. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows, and the store was empty except for Sophie behind the counter. His face was more serious than usual, the lines around his eyes deeper. "We need to talk," he said quietly, glancing around the empty store. "Not here." Sophie nodded, her heart beating faster. "My shift ends in 5 minutes. We could go to the diner next door?" Bear shook his head. "Too public. Let's sit in my truck." Minutes later, they were in Bear's pickup, parked behind the store where no one could see them. The leather seats creaked as Bear shifted uncomfortably, his hands resting on the steering wheel. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts. "That research you've been doing," he started, his voice gravelly, "about Richard Maxwell." Sophie's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Small town. Word gets around." He turned to face her, his expression grim. "You need to understand what you're getting into." The air in the truck felt heavy as Bear began his story. Maxwell showed up 3 years ago, all smiles and handshakes at first. Wanted to buy our land, said he was going to build some fancy development. His knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. When we refused, things got ugly. Sophie listened intently as Bear described how Maxwell had systematically tried to force them out. First came the building inspectors with fabricated violations. Then mysterious complaints from neighbors who later admitted they'd been paid off. Anonymous threats left on their vehicles. Last winter, one of my guys, Tommy, got jumped outside his house. 3 men with masks. Bear's jaw clenched. Tommy spent 2 weeks in the hospital. No proof it was Maxwell, of course, but we knew. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Sophie asked softly. Bear let out a bitter laugh. "Maxwell's got half the force in his pocket. The other half won't touch him because of his connections upstate." He turned to look at her, his eyes intense. "That land, it's more than just property to us. It's where we take care of our own. We've got veterans there who can't handle regular society. Single moms we help out. Kids who need a safe place." Sophie felt her throat tighten. The hellsangels she'd heard so much about, the ones everyone feared, were actually protecting people Maxwell wanted to displace. "I've found things in my research," she said, pulling out her notebook. "Pattern of businesses being forced out. Health code violations appearing out of nowhere. There's more. I know there is. I just need to dig deeper." Bear's expression darkened. "This isn't your fight, Sophie. Maxwell's dangerous. I don't want you getting hurt because of us." Sophie straightened in her seat, meeting his concerned gaze. "I'm already involved. I have research skills, contacts at the library, access to databases. Let me help." She paused, then added more quietly, "You helped me when I needed it most. Let me return the favor." Bear studied her for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right, but we do this careful, smart, no risks." Sophie felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness flutter in her stomach. She knew she was stepping into something bigger than herself. But looking at Bear, this man who had shown her such unexpected kindness, she knew it was the right thing to do. Sophie's fingers trembled as she flipped through another dusty file in the dim light of the library's back room. The clock on the wall showed 10:45 p.m. She'd been here for hours, thanks to Martha, the elderly librarian who trusted her enough to let her stay after closing. The stack of papers in front of her told a story that made her stomach churn. Records of property deals, foreclosures, and mysterious accidents filled the local newspaper archives. All of them connected to Richard Maxwell, the businessman threatening Bear's land. Sophie's eyes burned from staring at microfilm screens and old documents, but she couldn't stop. Not when she was so close. "This can't be a coincidence," she muttered, spreading out 3 different articles on the table. Each detailed a suspicious fire at properties that Maxwell had tried to buy. The owners had refused to sell, and within months, their buildings had burned down. The official reports called them accidents, but Sophie knew better. Her hands shook as she carefully photographed each document with her phone. The evidence was building. Forged permits, suspicious insurance claims, and a pattern of intimidation that stretched back 15 years. Maxwell hadn't just targeted Bear's gang. He'd been systematically destroying people's lives across 3 counties. A sound echoed through the empty library. Footsteps. Sophie froze, her heart pounding. The security guard always announced himself with a friendly, "Just me." This time, there was only silence. She quickly gathered the papers, sliding them back into their folders as quietly as possible. The footsteps grew closer, moving with purpose through the reference section. Sophie's hands trembled as she shoved her phone into her pocket and grabbed her bag. The footsteps stopped. Sophie held her breath, crouching behind a shelf. Through the gaps between books, she caught a glimpse of a man in an expensive suit. Not the security guard. He moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Sophie's mind raced. The only exit was past the reference section, but there was a window in the back room. It wasn't far up from the ground. She'd seen kids sitting on the ledge during summer reading programs. The man's shoes clicked against the floor as he moved closer to her section. Sophie crawled slowly toward the back room, keeping low. Her knee hit a chair, making it scrape slightly against the floor. The footsteps quickened. Sophie abandoned stealth for speed, sprinting the last few feet to the back room. She heard the man's pace break into a run. With trembling hands, she pushed up the old window, wincing at its squeak. Cool night air rushed in. The footsteps were almost at the door. Without hesitating, Sophie swung her legs over the windowsill and pushed off. She landed hard on the grass, stumbling but keeping her balance. Behind her, she heard the man curse. Sophie ran. Her shoes pounded against the pavement as she sprinted through the parking lot, not daring to look back. She didn't stop until she reached her car, hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the lock. Once inside, she slumped against the seat, heart racing. The photos on her phone could bring Maxwell down, but now she understood the true cost of what she was doing. This wasn't just about helping Bear anymore. It was about stopping someone who had hurt countless people. Sophie started her car, checking her mirrors constantly as she pulled out of the parking lot. She was scared, but more than that, she was angry. Maxwell had to be stopped, and she had the evidence to do it. The old warehouse sat at the edge of town, its weathered walls keeping secrets as ancient as the building itself. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. 24 members of Bear's gang filled the space, their leather vests adorned with patches that told stories of brotherhood and loyalty. Sophie sat near the back, feeling out of place among these hardened men, yet somehow knowing she belonged. Bear stood at the front, his massive frame casting a shadow in the dim light. His usual stern expression softened slightly when his eyes met Sophie's. The research she'd gathered lay spread across a makeshift table, newspaper clippings, property records, and photographs that painted a picture of corruption. "Sophie's found something," Bear announced, his deep voice echoing off the walls. "Maxwell's been playing dirty longer than we thought." He gestured to the evidence before them. 3 fires in 5 years, all properties he wanted, all refused to sell. The gang members shifted uncomfortably. Some cast curious glances at Sophie. Others nodded with growing understanding. A tall man with graying hair, they called him Hawk, stepped forward. "We've always known he was dirty," Hawk said. "But this is different." Sophie's heart raced as she stood up. Her voice quivered at first but grew stronger with each word. "There's more. The insurance claims, the timing of the accidents, it's all connected. He's been systematically forcing people out of their homes and businesses." Bear watched her with an intensity that made her pause. There was something different in his eyes now. Not just respect, but a kind of wonder. She'd risked her safety, spent countless hours digging through records, all to help them. And she'd done it without asking for anything in return. "This changes everything," Bear said quietly. The room fell silent. "We've been fighting Maxwell the only way we knew how, with fists and threats. But that's his game. He wants us to look like the criminals he says we are." Sophie stepped closer, clutching a folder to her chest. "The evidence is solid. With this, we could take legal action, show everyone who he really is." The gang members murmured among themselves. Some looked skeptical, others intrigued. Bear raised his hand and the room fell silent again. "I've made my decision," he announced, his voice firm but calm. "No more running, no more playing his game." He looked at each member in turn, his gaze finally settling on Sophie. "We're going to fight back, but not like before. No violence, no threats. We're going to do this right." The tension in the room shifted. These were men used to solving problems with force, but they trusted Bear. If he said there was another way, they would follow. "Sophie's shown us there's power in the truth," Bear continued. "Maxwell thinks we're just thugs. He doesn't expect us to fight him in the courts, with evidence and lawyers. That's exactly why we're going to do it." Sophie felt tears welling up in her eyes. Bear had taken her evidence seriously, had listened to her suggestions. More than that, he was willing to change, to find a better way. The tough exterior she'd first seen at the convenience store seemed softer now, revealing the good man she'd always suspected was there. The gang members nodded one by one, some clapping Bear on the shoulder in support. They were rough men, hardened by life, but in that moment, Sophie saw something else in them too. Hope for a different kind of future, one where justice didn't have to come from the barrel of a gun. The businessman's office occupied the entire top floor of the tallest building in town. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the streets below, where normal life carried on, unaware of the confrontation taking place above. Maxwell sat behind his massive mahogany desk, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched Bear and Sophie enter. Well, well, the biker and the shopgirl. To what do I owe this interesting visit? His voice dripped with condescension as he adjusted his silk tie. Sophie stepped forward, her hand steady as she placed a thick manila folder on his desk. We know what you did, Mr. Maxwell. The fires, the threats, the bribes. She opened the folder, spreading out documents one by one. Like the Thompson warehouse in 2019, they refused to sell, then mysteriously burned down. A week later, Maxwell's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. Tragic accidents happen all the time, my dear. 3 times in 5 years? Sophie's voice remained calm as she laid out more papers. Always properties you wanted, always after the owners refused to sell. We have witness statements, insurance investigations, even some interesting bank transfers. Bear stood silently behind Sophie, his massive frame casting a shadow across Maxwell's desk. His presence spoke volumes without saying a word. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, trying to appear relaxed, but his fingers drummed restlessly on his armrest. Anyone can make accusations. Prove it. That's exactly what we have here. Sophie pulled out another document. Your connection to the shell company that bought the burned properties. The same company that's been trying to force Bear's gang out of their territory. For the first time, Maxwell's smile faltered. He stood up slowly, placing both hands on his desk as he leaned forward. Listen carefully, Miss Reed. You're playing a very dangerous game. Do you really think anyone will believe the word of a small-town nobody and a gang of thugs over a respected businessman? The evidence speaks for itself, Sophie replied, standing her ground. Maxwell's facade cracked. His face twisted with anger as he jabbed a finger at Sophie. You stupid girl. I'll bury you. By the time I'm done, you won't be able to get a job cleaning toilets in this town. Your mother's medical bills? They'll triple. Every door will close in your face. Bear stepped forward, his movement deliberate and controlled. That's enough. His voice was low, almost quiet, but it filled the room with unmistakable authority. We're done hiding from you, Maxwell. Done watching you hurt people. Touch her, or anyone else in this town, and what happens next will be your doing. Maxwell's face reddened. Is that a threat, Lawson? No. Bear's eyes were cold and steady. It's a promise. We're taking everything to the authorities. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement. Your time of burning down people's lives is over. Maxwell's hands clenched into fists. Get out of my office, both of you. You have no idea what you're starting. No, Sophie said, gathering the documents. We're finishing what you started. The businessman's laugh was sharp and ugly. You really think you can destroy me? I'll crush you both. Everything you care about, everyone you love, I'll take it all away. Bear took one step closer, his shadow now completely engulfing Maxwell's desk. Try it, he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years of built-up determination. We're done running. The tension in Maxwell's office could be cut with a knife. The businessman's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against his desk as he studied the evidence before him, his confident smile beginning to crack around the edges. A low rumble of motorcycles filled the air. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a line of bikes pulled up to the building. Maxwell's face twitched with annoyance as he watched Bear's gang members dismount their motorcycles one by one. More of your thugs, Maxwell sneered at Bear, coming to rough me up? The office door opened, and 5 members of Bear's gang walked in. But instead of leather and chains, they carried briefcases and folders. Tom, Bear's second-in-command, wore reading glasses and carried a laptop. Actually, Tom said, setting up his computer on Maxwell's desk, I'm here with the financial records from your offshore accounts. He adjusted his glasses and began typing. 15 years as a forensic accountant before joining the Angels. Interesting what you can find when you know where to look. Another gang member, Mike, stepped forward. His tattooed hands held a stack of legal documents. 20 years as a real estate attorney. Those property transfers you forced through? Not as clean as you thought. Maxwell's face grew pale as more gang members presented their evidence. Each one wasn't just a biker. They were professionals who had discovered his corruption from every angle. "You see?" Bear spoke for the first time, his voice steady and controlled. "My brothers aren't just bikers. We're people who saw through your facade and chose to stand against it." Sophie watched as the businessman's composure crumbled. Sweat beaded on his forehead as Tom projected financial records onto the office wall, showing years of money laundering and fraud. "This is absurd," Maxwell sputtered, loosening his tie. "You can't prove any of this." "The SEC would disagree," Tom replied calmly. "They're very interested in these numbers." Maxwell stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. He walked to a painting on the wall, swung it aside to reveal a safe, and quickly spun the dial. His hands shook as he pulled out several stacks of cash. "Name your price," he said, spreading the money across his desk. "Everyone has one. What'll it take for this to disappear?" Bear didn't move. His massive frame remained still as a mountain, his eyes fixed on Maxwell. "You still don't understand," he said quietly. "This isn't about money. It's about doing what's right." More cash joined the pile as Maxwell grew desperate. "Think about it. You could all live comfortably. No more struggling, no more fighting for territory." The gang members exchanged looks of disgust. Sophie stepped forward, gathering up her evidence while Tom closed his laptop. "The FBI already has copies of everything," she said, "along with the State Attorney General's office." Maxwell slumped back in his chair, the fight draining from his face as he looked at the assembled group. His empire of lies was crumbling, and for once, he couldn't buy his way out. Bear's gang stood united, not with violence or intimidation, but with the truth. They weren't just bikers anymore. They were warriors for justice, each in their own way. The businessman's hands trembled as he realized his usual tactics of bribery and threats were useless against people who valued integrity over money. The vibration of Sophie's phone cut through the tense atmosphere of Maxwell's office. Her heart skipped when she saw the hospital's number flash across the screen. With trembling fingers, she stepped away from the group and answered. "Hello?" Her voice was barely a whisper. The doctor's words hit her like a physical blow. Her mother's condition had deteriorated rapidly. The experimental treatment wasn't working as hoped. They needed Sophie there, now. Sophie's legs felt weak. She steadied herself against the wall, aware of Bear's concerned gaze from across the room. The evidence they'd gathered against Maxwell lay spread across his desk, the culmination of weeks of work. They were so close to bringing him down, to protecting the town and the angels. But her mother needed her. "I'll be there as soon as I can," Sophie managed to say before ending the call. Her hand dropped to her side, still clutching the phone like a lifeline. Bear crossed the room in 3 long strides, his presence solid and reassuring. "What is it?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "My mom," Sophie's voice cracked. "The doctors say she's getting worse. They want me there right away." She looked up at Bear, her eyes filling with tears. "I have to go." The conflict showed plainly on her face, the weight of choosing between staying to help Bear and his gang fight Maxwell and rushing to her mother's bedside. Everything they'd worked for was reaching its critical moment. The evidence they'd gathered could finally stop Maxwell's corrupt dealings and save the Angels' territory. But when Sophie thought of her mother lying in that hospital bed, alone and scared, her decision crystallized. She couldn't abandon her family, not now. "I'm so sorry," she whispered to Bear, wiping her eyes. "I know the timing couldn't be worse, but I have to leave. My mom. She's all I have left." Bear's expression remained stoic, but his eyes softened with understanding. He reached out and squeezed her shoulder gently. "Family comes first," he said simply. "Always has." Sophie looked around the office, at Tom with his laptop full of damning evidence, at the other angels who had shown her a different side to their rough exterior. These people had become like family too, in their own way. The guilt of leaving them twisted in her stomach. "The evidence is all here," she said, gesturing to the papers on Maxwell's desk. "Everything you need to bring him down. I just wish—" Bear shook his head, cutting off her apology. "You've done more than enough. Go to your mother." Sophie gathered her belongings with shaking hands, her mind already racing ahead to flight bookings and hospital visits. As she headed for the door, she turned back one last time. Bear stood there, his massive frame silhouetted against the window, watching her go. His face betrayed no emotion, but Sophie could see the sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. She wanted to say something more, to explain how much their friendship had meant to her, how sorry she was to leave in the middle of their fight, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she gave him a small nod, which he returned, a gesture that contained all their unspoken understanding. With her heart heavy, Sophie walked out of the office, leaving behind the unlikely family she'd found in this small town. Sophie's hands trembled as she folded her clothes, placing them carefully into her worn suitcase. The small apartment she'd called home felt different now, emptier somehow. Sunlight streamed through the window, catching dust motes dancing in the air, making everything feel dreamlike and distant. A knock at the door made her pause. She knew who it was before she opened it. Bear stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway, his usual intimidating presence softened by the concern in his eyes. "Need help?" he asked, his voice gruff but gentle. Sophie shook her head, managing a weak smile. "Almost done. Just a few more things." She turned back to her packing, aware of Bear's quiet presence as he followed her inside. He leaned against the wall, watching her move around the apartment. Neither of them mentioned the businessman or the evidence they'd gathered. Those problems seemed far away now, overshadowed by the weight of her mother's illness. "The angels will handle Maxwell," Bear said, as if reading her thoughts. "You've done more than enough." Sophie picked up a framed photo of her and her mother from happier times. She wrapped it carefully in a t-shirt before placing it in the suitcase. "I feel like I'm abandoning everything we worked for." "Family comes first," Bear replied, his voice firm but kind. "Always." The words struck Sophie hard, bringing tears to her eyes. She wiped them away quickly, but Bear had already seen. He stepped forward, his weathered hand resting briefly on her shoulder. "I don't know if I'll be able to come back," Sophie admitted, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since the phone call. "Mom might need long-term care and "Do what you need to do," Bear interrupted gently. "The town will still be here." Sophie zipped up her suitcase, the finality of the sound echoing in the quiet room. Bear picked it up before she could, carrying it effortlessly to her car. The morning air was crisp, the town just beginning to wake up. As Bear placed the suitcase in her trunk, Sophie looked around at the familiar streets. The convenience store where she'd first met Bear stood just visible around the corner. It felt like a lifetime ago now. "Thank you," she said, turning to Bear, "for everything." He nodded, his expression unreadable behind his beard. But his eyes were soft, showing the gentle soul she'd discovered beneath his tough exterior. Sophie got into her car, starting the engine. Through the windshield, she watched Bear step back, his large frame growing smaller in her rearview mirror as she pulled away. As she drove through the quiet streets, memories washed over her. The unexpected kindness of a stranger that had turned into something more. The fight for justice that had given her purpose. The connections she'd made with people she never would have imagined knowing. Despite the heaviness in her heart, Sophie felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over her. She had done what she could here, made a difference in her own way. Now it was time to be there for her mother, to focus on the family that needed her most. The town slowly disappeared behind her as she merged onto the highway, but its impact on her life would remain. Whatever came next, she knew she was stronger for having been here, for having known Bear and his unexpected kindness. Sophie sat in the hospital room, watching her mother sleep peacefully. The steady beep of monitors filled the sterile space, a constant reminder of why she'd left everything behind. Afternoon sunlight filtered through thin curtains, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Her mother stirred, and Sophie adjusted the blanket, tucking it gently around her shoulders. The treatment was working, slowly but surely. Each day brought small improvements, tiny victories that made the decision to come here feel right. And yet, her hand drifted to her phone, thumb hovering over Bear's number. She hadn't called him, not since that first week away. What would she say? The memory of his steady presence, his quiet strength, made her heart ache in ways she hadn't expected. A nurse came in to check vitals, offering Sophie a sympathetic smile. "You should get some fresh air, dear. You've been here all day." Sophie nodded but didn't move. Instead, she found herself thinking about the convenience store, about Bear's unexpected kindness that day when everything had seemed so hopeless. The memory was vivid, his massive frame, the gentleness in his eyes that contradicted his rough exterior, the way he'd slipped that money onto the counter without a word. Outside the window, a motorcycle rumbled past, and Sophie's heart jumped before settling back into its familiar rhythm. Every leather jacket, every motorcycle sound made her think of him. She wondered how the fight against the businessman was going, if Bear and his gang were okay. Her mother's voice, weak but clear, startled her from her thoughts. "You're thinking about him again." Sophie turned, surprised. "Mom, I didn't know you were awake." A mother knows that look. Her mother patted the bed beside her. "Tell me about him again." Sophie sat on the edge of the bed, smiling despite herself. "He's not what people think. Everyone sees this tough biker, this scary gang leader, but he's—" She trailed off, searching for the right words. "Kind," her mother finished. "You've told me. Several times, actually." Sophie felt her cheeks warm. "I just hope they're all okay. The businessman was dangerous, and I left them in the middle of everything." "Sometimes life makes these choices for us," her mother said softly. "But that doesn't mean they're permanent." Before Sophie could respond, her phone buzzed. An unknown number flashed on the screen. She answered, her heart racing. "Sophie?" A familiar voice, one of Bear's gang members, Tommy. "We did it. We got him." Sophie stood up straight, her free hand pressed against her chest. "What? How?" "That evidence you gathered? It was the key. The feds had been watching Maxwell for months, but they needed proof of the property fraud. Once we handed everything over," Tommy's voice was triumphant, "he's going away for a long time." Relief flooded through Sophie, making her legs weak. She sank into the chair beside her mother's bed. "And Bear? Is he okay?" "He's good. We all are. The town's safe now. He can't touch any of us anymore." Tommy paused. "Bear's been different since you left, though. Quieter, more brooding than usual, if you can believe it." Sophie's mother watched her face, a knowing smile playing at her lips. The victory should have felt complete, but something was missing. The town was safe, the businessman defeated, but Sophie's heart was still caught between two worlds. The one where her mother needed her, and the one where a tough biker with a gentle soul had shown her what kindness truly meant. Chapter 18. The Return. The hospital corridor felt different that morning. Sophie walked with purpose, her footsteps echoing against the polished floors as she headed to her mother's room. 2 weeks of steady improvement had changed everything. The dark clouds that had hung over them were finally starting to clear. Her mother sat up in bed, looking stronger than she had in months. The morning light caught the silver in her hair, and her smile reached her eyes. Something Sophie hadn't seen in far too long. "You're sure about this?" Sophie asked, adjusting her mother's pillows for the 10th time. "The doctors say you're stable, but I can stay longer if you need me." Her mother reached for Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. "Honey, I'm getting better. The treatments are working, and your aunt is here to help." She looked at Sophie knowingly. "Besides, I think we both know where your heart is pulling you." Sophie's cheeks flushed as she packed the last of her clothes into her duffel bag. The familiar weight of uncertainty settled in her stomach. But this time it was different, tinged with hope and possibility rather than fear. The drive back felt surreal. Miles of highway stretched before her, each one bringing her closer to the small town she'd left behind. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as memories flooded back. Bear's unexpected kindness, the late nights researching the businessman's dealings, the way Bear's eyes would soften when he thought no one was looking. The radio played softly as urban sprawl gave way to open country. Sophie's mind wandered to the convenience store, wondering if everything looked the same. Would her replacement still be there? Had they changed the faded signs in the windows? Would Bear— She shook her head, trying to focus on the road. The sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, making the world seem softer somehow. Signs for familiar towns began appearing, making her heart beat faster. Sophie stopped at a rest area, stretching her legs and checking her phone. No messages from anyone in town. She hadn't told them she was coming back. Part of her wanted it that way, wanted to see their reactions, especially his. Back on the road, she watched the landscape change. More trees appeared, hugging the highway's edges. The hills grew more pronounced, and the air coming through her cracked window carried the scent of pine and wild grass. The "Welcome To" sign appeared ahead, its paint slightly more chipped than she remembered. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she drove past it. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. The same houses lined the streets. The same people walked their dogs in the early evening light, but she saw it all through new eyes. She passed the park where she'd often see Bear's motorcycles parked, their chrome gleaming in the sun. The library where she'd spent countless hours digging through records. The diner where she'd sometimes catch glimpses of Bear's gang members, looking so out of place among the regular customers. Her car seemed to know the way to the convenience store, turning down familiar streets without much conscious thought from Sophie. The parking lot came into view, and her breath caught in her throat. The store's lights glowed warmly in the growing dusk, a beacon drawing her home. Sophie parked her car, her heart pounding against her ribs. Through the store's windows, she could see movement inside. Customers browsing the aisles, the new cashier arranging items on the counter. She gathered her courage, opened her car door, and stepped out into the cool evening air. Sophie's hands trembled as she pulled into the convenience store parking lot. The familiar sign hung above, a bit more worn than she remembered, but still the same place where everything had started. Her heart thundered in her chest as she spotted Bear's motorcycle parked near the entrance, its chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. The bell above the door chimed as she stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee and fresh-baked cookies, something new since she'd left. Behind the counter stood Mary, the elderly owner, who gasped when she saw Sophie. "Well, look who's back," Mary called out, her voice warm with welcome. But Sophie barely heard her. Her attention was fixed on the tall figure standing by the coffee machine, his broad shoulders instantly recognizable. Bear turned slowly, and their eyes met across the store. The coffee pot in his hand froze mid-pour. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The usual hardness in Bear's expression had softened, and something flickered in his eyes. Relief, maybe even joy, though he tried to hide it. Sophie took a tentative step forward, then another. "Hi," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Bear set down the coffee pot carefully, his movements deliberate. "You're back," he said, his deep voice rougher than usual. Mary, sensing the weight of the moment, quietly slipped into the back room, leaving them alone among the aisles of snacks and supplies. "I heard about what happened with the businessman," Sophie said, moving closer. "The whole operation came down?" Bear nodded, his eyes never leaving her face. "Your evidence made it happen. Couldn't have done it without you." The store felt different now. The fluorescent lights seemed softer. The usual hum of the refrigerators faded into the background. It was just them, standing there, with months of unspoken words hanging in the air between them. "My mother's doing better," Sophie offered, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "The new treatment worked. She's getting stronger every day." A small smile tugged at the corner of Bear's mouth, a rare sight that made Sophie's heart skip. He took a step toward her, closing the distance between them. "Come with me," he said quietly, gesturing toward the store's small break room. Inside the cramped space, with its single window and worn table, Bear turned to face her. His presence filled the tiny room, but Sophie didn't feel intimidated anymore. Instead, she felt safe. "What you did for this town," Bear began, his voice low and earnest. "What you did for me and my people. Not many would have taken that risk." He paused, struggling with the words. "I'm proud of you, Sophie. You stood up when it mattered. Showed more courage than most people I know." Sophie felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. "I couldn't just walk away," she whispered. "Not from the town. Not from—" She met his gaze. "Not from you." Bear's expression softened further, the tough exterior melting away completely. He reached out, hesitantly at first, and took her hand in his. His palm was warm and rough against hers, but his touch was gentle. The simple gesture spoke volumes, about trust, about connection, about something deeper that had grown between them despite all odds. They stood there in comfortable silence, their joined hands bridging the gap between their two very different worlds that somehow, unexpectedly, had become one. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Sophie's new office, casting warm light across the freshly painted walls. She stood in the doorway, taking in the modest space that would soon become Hope's Haven, her non-profit organization dedicated to helping families struggling with medical bills and caregiving responsibilities. The small storefront hadn't been much to look at when she first found it, but with Bear and his gang's help, they had transformed it into something special. The walls were now a soft blue, with comfortable chairs arranged in a welcoming circle. Resource pamphlets lined the neat shelves, and a coffee station waited in the corner. Sophie ran her fingers along the new desk, remembering how Bear had insisted on building it himself. He'd spent 3 days working on it, his large hands carefully sanding each edge until it was perfect. The wood gleamed under her touch, smooth as silk. "You're here early." Bear's deep voice came from behind her. He stood in the doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee from the diner down the street. "Couldn't sleep," Sophie admitted, accepting the coffee with a grateful smile. "I keep thinking about all the families we could help." She took a sip, the warm liquid settling her nerves. "People like my mom and me, who just need someone to point them in the right direction." Bear nodded, understanding in his eyes. He moved to the window, adjusting the blinds to let in more light. "The woman from the hospital called again. Said she's got 3 more families who could use our help." Sophie opened her laptop, pulling up the spreadsheet she'd created to track their cases. Already, word had spread about Hope's Haven, and they hadn't even officially opened yet. "I've been working on a system to match families with the right resources," she explained, showing Bear the color-coded document. Red for urgent medical needs, yellow for ongoing care support, blue for financial assistance. Bear leaned over her shoulder, his presence steady and reassuring. "You've thought of everything," he said softly, pride evident in his voice. "Well, I had a good teacher in organization," Sophie smiled, thinking of all the hours she'd spent watching Bear coordinate his gang's legitimate business ventures. Who knew a Hell's Angel would be so good with spreadsheets? Bear's quiet chuckle filled the room. He moved to help her arrange the chairs for their first support group meeting later that day. "The guys want to know if you need anything else for the opening," he said, straightening a frame on the wall, a simple quote about hope that Sophie had chosen. "Just their support," Sophie replied, watching as Bear methodically checked each chair for stability. It amazed her how naturally he had taken to this new role, how his protective instincts had found a different outlet. The man who had once struck fear into people's hearts now spent his weekends delivering care packages to homebound patients. "You've got that," Bear assured her, his voice gruff but gentle. "Always will." Sophie looked around the room one more time, at all the pieces falling into place. The filing cabinets full of resource information, the small kitchen stocked with snacks for support group meetings, the children's corner with books and toys. Everything designed to make families feel safe and supported during their hardest times. Bear moved to stand beside her, his solid presence grounding her as always. Together, they watched the morning light fill their new space, ready to begin this chapter of their lives, not as a tough biker and a convenience store cashier, but as partners in something bigger than themselves. "Not everyone's going to like what we're doing here," Bear said, his deep voice gentle as he watched Sophie arrange informational packets on the desk. Several local business owners had already voiced their concerns about having a motorcycle gang involved in community outreach. Sophie straightened a stack of papers with determined hands. "They'll come around when they see the good we're doing." Her voice carried more confidence than she felt. The past week had been rough. 3 potential donors had backed out after learning about Bear's involvement. Bear leaned against the wall, his massive frame making the space feel smaller. "Maybe I should step back," he offered. "Let you handle the public side of things." "Absolutely not." Sophie crossed the room to stand in front of him, her eyes fierce. "You're as much a part of this as I am. The whole point is showing people that everyone deserves a second chance, that help can come from unexpected places." A knock at the door interrupted them. Martha Chen, the town's bank manager, stood in the doorway, clutching her purse tightly. Her eyes darted nervously between Sophie and Bear. "Come in, Mrs. Chen," Sophie welcomed her warmly. "Thank you for meeting with us." Martha stepped inside hesitantly. Bear moved to leave, but Sophie caught his arm. "Stay," she whispered. He nodded, taking a seat in one of the corner chairs, trying to make himself less imposing. "I've reviewed your proposal," Martha began, settling into a chair. "The bank has concerns." She pulled out a folder. "Your personal credit is good, Sophie, but the association with—" She glanced at Bear. "The Hell's Angels have already pledged support," Sophie interjected. "They've helped renovate this space, and several members are trained in peer counseling now." Martha's eyebrows rose. "Peer counseling?" Bear spoke up, his voice softer than usual. "We know what it's like to feel like you've got nowhere to turn. Sometimes people just need someone to listen." Sophie pulled out their business plan. "We've already helped 3 families navigate medical billing issues, and we're partnering with the hospital to identify families in need. All we need is the startup loan to expand our services." Martha studied the documents, her expression thoughtful. "The numbers are solid," she admitted, "and the community does need these services." She looked up at Bear. "Would you be willing to undergo background checks? All volunteers would need to." "Already done," Bear replied, producing a folder of his own. "Everyone who's involved has been cleared. We want to do this right." Martha's professional demeanor softened slightly. "I have to admit, this is more organized than I expected." She reviewed the background checks, nodding slowly. "And you've already secured matching funds from private donors?" "Yes," Sophie confirmed. "The Anderson Foundation has pledged to match any loan up to $50,000. Martha closed her folders and stood up. "I'll need to present this to the loan committee, but—" She smiled for the first time. "I think we can make this work. Your passion for this project is evident, and the community need is clear. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from unexpected places. Sophie felt tears pricking at her eyes as she shook Martha's hand. Bear stood respectfully as Martha left, then turned to Sophie with a rare smile. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Sophie corrected him, her heart full. With this loan and the matching funds, Hope's Haven would be able to help so many more families. She looked around their small office, already imagining it full of people finding the support they desperately needed. Bear's large hand found hers, squeezing gently. "This is just the beginning," he said softly. The autumn breeze rustled through the leaves as Sophie and Bear sat on the front steps of their newly established nonprofit center. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden porch, where they shared coffee from mismatched mugs, Sophie's delicate ceramic one and Bear's heavy steel thermos. "3 more families signed up for assistance yesterday," Sophie said, her eyes bright with pride. She leaned slightly against Bear's solid frame, drawing comfort from his presence. The simple act felt natural now, though it had taken months for both of them to lower their guards completely. Bear nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The Jenkins family stopped by too. Their little girl's doing better with the new treatments. Sophie's heart warmed at the gentleness in his voice. The tough biker who had once struck fear into people's hearts now kept coloring books and stuffed animals in his office for when families brought their children. It was these little gestures that showed how much he'd changed, or perhaps just revealed who he'd been all along. "Your guys did an amazing job fixing Mrs. Thompson's roof," Sophie mentioned, sipping her coffee. The entire motorcycle club had shown up last weekend, tools in hand, to help the elderly widow whose house had been damaged in the recent storm. Bear shrugged, but Sophie could see the pride in his eyes. "The boys needed something good to do with their hands. Makes a nice change from—" He trailed off, but Sophie understood. The past didn't need words anymore. Inside the center, phones started ringing as their small staff arrived for the day. What had started as just the 2 of them had grown into a proper organization, with volunteers and even a few paid positions. Bear's motorcycle club members took turns manning the front desk, their leather vests now adorned with patches that read Community Support Team, alongside their Hell's Angels insignias. "Remember when people used to cross the street when they saw us coming?" Bear mused, his voice carrying a hint of amusement rather than bitterness. Sophie smiled, remembering her own first impression of him. Now they stopped to ask when the next fundraiser is. Just then, Mayor Wilson's car pulled into the parking lot. The same mayor who'd once tried to run the Hell's Angels out of town now made weekly visits to coordinate community efforts. He stepped out of his car, carrying a box of donuts, Bear's favorite maple bars included. "Morning, you two," he called out cheerfully. "Thought we could discuss that new after-school program over breakfast." Sophie watched as Bear stood to greet the mayor, the 2 men shaking hands like old friends. The sight still amazed her, this unlikely alliance that had grown into something beautiful and transformative. Inside, they could hear Sarah, one of Bear's toughest-looking gang members, gently explaining insurance paperwork to an elderly couple. Her tattooed arms cradled their grandchild while they filled out forms. The couple showed no fear, only gratitude. These moments had become their new normal. The center hummed with activity, phones ringing, coffee brewing, people coming and going. Each day brought new challenges, but also new opportunities to help, to heal, to grow. Bear caught Sophie's eye across the room and gave her that special look, the one that said more than words ever could. They had built this together, this safe haven of hope and second chances. What had started with a simple act of kindness in a convenience store had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined. The transformation wasn't just in the town's perception of the Hell's Angels. It was in all of them. They had become more than a motorcycle club or a non-profit organization. They had become a family, bound together by their shared mission to make life better for others. The autumn breeze rustled through the leaves as Sophie and Bear sat on the front steps of their newly established non-profit center. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered wooden porch, where they shared coffee from mismatched mugs, Sophie's delicate ceramic one and Bear's heavy steel thermos. 3 more families signed up for assistance yesterday, Sophie said, her eyes bright with pride. She leaned slightly against Bear's solid frame, drawing comfort from his presence. Bear nodded, his expression softening as he watched a young mother walk past with her children. The woman smiled and waved, no longer afraid of the man whose tattoos and leather vest had once caused people to cross the street to avoid him. "Never thought I'd see the day," Bear said quietly, his deep voice carrying a hint of wonder. "People used to run from us. Now they come to us for help." Sophie reached over and squeezed his hand. "That's because they finally see what I saw that first day in the store. The good man behind the tough exterior." The morning air filled with the sounds of the town coming to life. Cars drove past, shop owners flipped their signs to open, and the familiar rumble of motorcycles approached from down the street. Several of Bear's gang members pulled up, their bikes gleaming in the sunlight. "Morning, boss," called out Mike, one of the younger members. "Got those supplies you asked for?" He gestured to the boxes strapped to their bikes. "School supplies for the kids?" Sophie asked, standing up to help unload. Bear nodded, following her lead. "Winter's coming. Figured some of our families could use the help." They worked together, carrying boxes into the center. Sophie couldn't help but smile at the sight of these tough bikers carefully arranging notebooks, pencils, and backpacks on shelves. It was a far cry from their old reputation. "We've got that meeting with the town council next week," Sophie reminded Bear as they organized the supplies. "They want to discuss expanding our services." Bear paused, his massive hands holding a pack of colored pencils that looked tiny in comparison. "Never thought I'd be welcome in that building, let alone invited to speak." "Things change," Sophie said softly. "People change." They stepped outside again, watching as more of the town came alive. The local baker waved as she carried fresh bread into her shop. The hardware store owner nodded respectfully as he swept his sidewalk. Even the police chief, who once kept a close eye on Bear's gang, offered a friendly salute as he drove past. "Still got challenges ahead," Bear admitted, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Some folks ain't gonna change their minds about us overnight." Sophie slipped her hand into his, feeling the rough calluses against her palm. "Then we'll keep showing them, day by day, just like you showed me." Bear squeezed her hand gently, careful of his strength. "Never thought helping one crying cashier would change everything." "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness," Sophie replied, remembering that day that felt so long ago now. They began walking down the street together, their steps in sync. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, casting a warm glow over the small town they'd both come to love in different ways. Shop owners were closing up for the day, families were heading home for dinner, and the evening air carried the promise of cooler weather to come. Bear and Sophie walked in comfortable silence, their joined hands a testament to the unlikely bond they'd formed. Their shadows stretched long behind them as they made their way through the town they'd helped transform, their hearts full of peace and the quiet certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The town square buzzed with activity as strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed overhead. Tables laden with home-cooked dishes stretched across the grass, and the aroma of barbecue filled the air. Children darted between groups of adults, their laughter mixing with the soft country music playing from portable speakers. Sophie stood near the dessert table, watching in amazement as Bear helped Mrs. Henderson, the town's oldest resident, into a folding chair. His massive frame bent carefully as he made sure she was comfortable, and the elderly woman patted his tattooed hand with genuine affection. "Would you look at that?" Mayor Thompson said, stepping up beside Sophie. "If someone had told me a year ago that we'd be throwing a community appreciation dinner for the Hells Angels, I'd have thought they were crazy." He shook his head and smiled. "But here we are." Sophie's heart swelled as she watched more of Bear's gang members arrive, each carrying dishes to add to the potluck. They wore their leather vests proudly, but now the sight of them brought smiles instead of fear. Children ran up to high-five them, and townspeople called out greetings by name. "Bear!" little Tommy Martinez shouted, running up to him. "Can I sit on your motorcycle again?" Bear's stern face broke into a rare smile. "Later, kid, after you eat your vegetables." He ruffled the boy's hair, and Tommy scampered off to tell his friends. The mayor clinked his glass, gathering everyone's attention. "Folks, we're here tonight to celebrate two people who showed us that change is possible when we open our hearts." He gestured to Sophie and Bear. "Thanks to them, our town has a new lease on life. The nonprofit center has helped dozens of families, and our community is stronger than ever." Applause erupted from the crowd. Sophie felt tears welling up as she saw faces she'd helped. The Wilson family who'd nearly lost their home, the Browns who needed medical assistance for their daughter, and so many others. They were all here, all smiling, all part of this unlikely family they'd built. Bear moved to stand beside her, his presence steady and reassuring. The townspeople raised their glasses in a toast, and Sophie noticed that even some of the toughest-looking bikers were wiping their eyes. As the evening wore on and the crowd began to thin, Bear took Sophie's hand and led her away from the noise. They found a quiet spot on a small hill overlooking the square, where the stars twinkled as brightly as the strung lights below. Sophie leaned back against Bear's chest, feeling the rise and fall of his breathing. "Did you ever imagine this?" she asked softly. Bear's arm tightened around her. "Never," he admitted. "Spent most of my life thinking kindness was weakness. Then you showed up crying at that store counter, and everything changed." Below them, the remaining partygoers continued to chat and laugh. The sound of children playing mixed with the low rumble of motorcycle engines as some of the gang members headed home. The scene was a perfect blend of the old and the new. Leather-clad bikers helping to stack chairs, while town council members exchanged recipes with their wives. They sat together under the vast expanse of stars, witnesses to the miracle of transformation, both in their town and in themselves. Sophie felt Bear's steady heartbeat against her back, a rhythm that had become as familiar as her own. The night air was cool, but she felt nothing but warmth, surrounded by the love of their unlikely but perfect community. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.